Michael Carter was no stranger to hard times. A struggling single dad, every dollar he made went toward keeping the lights on and giving his little girl, Lily, the best life he could. But when he stopped to help a frail woman on the side of the road, shivering, pale, and clearly unwell, he had no idea that this simple act of kindness would change his life forever. Because this woman wasn't just anyone, she was Isabella Sinclair, a billionaire heiress known for her ruthless business empire. But she wasn't looking for money or power. She was looking for something far more valuable. And Michael might just be the man she's been searching for all along. Stick around, because this is a story of love, resilience, and how a single moment of kindness can lead to a future no one saw coming. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The scent of motor oil and rust clung to Michael Carter like a second skin, a constant reminder of the life he led. His hands, calloused from years of hard work, tightened around the wrench as he fought with a rusted bolt beneath the old sedan. The damn thing wouldn't budge. With a frustrated sigh, he wiped the sweat from his forehead, leaving behind a streak of grease. The shop was stifling, the heat pressing down on him like an invisible weight. The broken ceiling fan groaned weakly above, stirring the humid air just enough to remind him how little relief it actually provided. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, bathing the small town in a soft amber glow. To most people, it was a beautiful evening. To Michael, it meant one thing. He was late. Again. Glancing at the clock on the wall, he muttered a curse under his breath. Lily's daycare closed at 6, and it was already past 5:30. If he hit every green light, he might just make it. "Hey, Carter," his boss Rick called from the front of the shop, barely looking up from his paperwork. "Got another one coming in. Some guy's truck won't start." Michael clenched his jaw. Another job meant more money, and Lord knew he needed it. The rent was overdue. The electric bill sat unopened on the counter, mocking him, and just last night, Lily had asked for a new backpack because the strap on hers had finally given out. But if he took the job, he wouldn't make it in time. He forced a tight smile. "Can't. Gotta get my kid." Rick grunted, shaking his head. "Every damn day, Carter. Maybe if you worked a little later, you wouldn't always be behind." Michael didn't bother responding. He tossed his wrench onto the workbench, grabbed his keys, and peeled off his grease-stained coveralls as he rushed out the door. His old Chevy groaned as he turned the ignition, but to his relief, it started on the first try. That was a small victory. The drive to the daycare was a blur of red lights and anxious glances at the dashboard clock. Every minute felt like an eternity. He knew what was waiting for him when he got there. A tired daycare worker tapping her foot, a disapproving glance, the unspoken judgment of a man who never seemed to have his life together. By the time he pulled into the parking lot, the place was nearly empty. He barely had time to slam the truck into park before rushing inside. Lily was sitting at the small play table near the front desk, swinging her legs as she colored in a crumpled piece of paper. The second she saw him, her face lit up. "Daddy!" The relief in her voice made his chest tighten. Mrs. Gardner, the elderly woman who ran the daycare, gave him a look that landed somewhere between sympathy and quiet disappointment. "You're late again, Michael." "I know," he said, out of breath. "I'm sorry," she sighed, shaking her head. "You're lucky Lily's a patient one. Some kids get upset when their parents don't show up on time." Michael crouched in front of Lily, brushing a stray curl behind her ear. "You okay, Peanut?" She nodded enthusiastically. "Mrs. Gardner let me color while I waited. Look, I drew us." She held up the paper, a stick figure version of herself, holding hands with a much taller, messier version of him. Beside them was a house, drawn in bright red crayon, with a sun beaming overhead. Something about it made his throat tighten. "You did a great job, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "Let's get home, yeah?" Lily nodded, hopping off the chair and slipping her tiny hand into his. He looked back at Mrs. Gardner, expecting another scolding, but she just gave him a soft, knowing look. You're trying, Michael. I see that. Just don't burn yourself out. He wished he had the luxury of slowing down, but slowing down didn't put food on the table. Slowing down didn't keep the lights on. As they stepped outside into the cooling night, Lily hummed quietly to herself, swinging their joined hands back and forth. She didn't know about the overdue bills, the exhaustion that clung to him like a shadow, the weight of never feeling like he was enough. To her, he was just daddy. And for now, that was enough. The rain hammered against the windshield, turning the narrow country road into a slick, winding nightmare. Michael tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles white as his old Chevy rattled over the pothole-riddled asphalt. The heater barely worked, spitting out only the weakest hint of warmth, and his breath fogged against the glass. Lily was fast asleep in the back seat, curled up beneath the fleece blanket he kept there for nights like these. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her tiny face peaceful despite the cold. She deserved so much more than this. The gaslight flickered on, another problem for another day. Right now, all that mattered was getting home before the roads froze over completely. Then he saw her. At first he thought it was a trick of the rain, just another shadow cast by the dim glow of his headlights. But as he drew closer, the figure sharpened into something painfully real. A woman, hunched over near the edge of the road, barely upright, her coat soaked through and clinging to her like a second skin. She took a single step forward before her legs gave out beneath her, crumbling onto the icy shoulder. Michael swore under his breath and pulled onto the side of the road. The truck's tires skidded slightly, the mud swallowing them whole, but he barely noticed as he yanked the keys from the ignition and jumped out. The wind cut through him like a blade, the rain soaking through his hoodie in seconds, but he pushed forward. "Hey!" he called, rushing toward her. "You okay?" There was no response. She was shivering violently, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale beneath the wet strands of hair plastered against her skin. When he crouched down beside her, her eyes flickered open, just barely, deep brown, glazed over with exhaustion and something dangerously close to fever. "Help," she whispered, so faintly he almost didn't hear it. Michael didn't hesitate. He slipped his arms beneath her, startled by how light she was, how alarmingly cold. She tensed weakly in his grasp, but she was too far gone to fight. "All right, I got you," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He turned toward the truck, glancing through the rain at the back seat where Lily still slept. This was risky. He had no idea who this woman was, no idea if helping her was the right thing to do. But leaving her here in the freezing rain? That wasn't an option. The moment he settled her into the passenger seat, she slumped against the window, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Michael shut the door, jogged back around to the driver's side, and threw the truck into drive. As the rain blurred the road ahead, he stole another glance at her. She didn't look like she belonged out here. Her coat, though drenched, was expensive. Her nails were manicured. Her shoes, the kind that weren't meant for walking long distances. So why the hell was she stranded on an empty road in the middle of a storm? Michael exhaled, focusing on the road. Whatever the answer was, it would have to wait. Right now, the only thing that mattered was making sure she didn't pass out before they got home. The cab of the truck was freezing. The weak heater sputtered, doing little against the damp chill that clung to the woman beside him. Michael kept one hand on the wheel, the other adjusting the temperature dial as if that would somehow coax the old thing into working harder. It didn't. She hadn't said a word since he'd settled her into the passenger seat. Her body slumped against the door, her breathing uneven. Every few seconds a shiver racked through her, violent and uncontrollable, her soaked clothes doing nothing to protect her from the cold. Michael cursed under his breath and shrugged off his jacket, rough and worn from years of labor. He reached across the seat, draping it over her. At first she barely reacted. Then, with effort, her trembling fingers curled around the fabric, pulling it closer. "You're burning up," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You need a hospital." At that her head jerked slightly. It wasn't much, but the sheer force of her refusal was clear. No. The word came out hoarse, barely audible, but there was a desperation behind it that made Michael pause. He frowned, glancing at her as he slowed at a stop sign. You're running a fever. You can barely sit upright. What the hell do you mean? No! She swallowed, her throat working painfully. Please, no hospital. Michael exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel. He didn't know what kind of trouble she was in, but she was too weak to argue, too sick to be making decisions for herself, and yet there was something in her voice, some deep-rooted fear that made him hesitate. All right, he muttered. No hospital. She slumped back against the seat, as if those two words were enough to ease whatever panic had been rising in her chest. Michael gritted his teeth. This was a mistake. He didn't know her, didn't know what mess he might be getting himself into. But leaving her out there in the freezing rain hadn't been an option, and now, here she was, in his truck, shivering beneath his jacket. A stranger who had no business being on a dark, empty road, alone and sick. Michael sighed and pressed the gas. He'd take her home, just for the night. Just long enough for her to get warm, to stop shaking, to look a little less like she was going to pass out at any moment. Then she could be on her way, and whatever storm she was running from could stay far, far away from him. The front door creaked as Michael nudged it open, the warmth of the house rushing to meet them. It wasn't much. A small living room cluttered with Lily's toys, the faint scent of leftover soup lingering in the air. But it was home. He adjusted his grip on the woman in his arms, her head lolling weakly against his shoulder. She was barely conscious now, her breath warm but shallow against his neck. Lily's voice broke the quiet. "Daddy?" Michael turned, finding his 6-year-old standing in the hallway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Her messy curls stuck to her cheek, and the oversized pajama shirt he'd bought for her sagged at the shoulders. She blinked at him, then at the soaking wet woman in his arms. His stomach tightened. He hadn't exactly planned for an explanation. "Hey, Peanut," he said, shifting the weight of the woman against his chest. "It's okay. Go back to bed." Lily's eyes, wide and curious, locked onto the stranger. "Who's that?" Michael sighed, moving toward the couch. Someone who needed help. Lily patted forward, small feet nearly silent against the old wooden floors, watching as he carefully set the woman down. The second he pulled back, she let out a small, pained sound, her fingers instinctively clutching at the fabric of his hoodie. For the briefest moment, something protective twisted in Michael's chest. He gently pried her hand away and pulled the blanket over her trembling frame. Lily climbed onto the couch's armrest, her tiny legs swinging back and forth. She tilted her head, studying the woman with the sharp, innocent curiosity only a child could have. "She's pretty," Lily murmured. Michael huffed a quiet laugh. "She's sick." Lily reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against the woman's wrist, then frowned. "She's cold." "Yeah," Michael said, rubbing a hand down his face. "I know." Lily was quiet for a long moment, just watching the woman, her brow furrowed in that thoughtful way Michael had come to recognize as trouble. Finally, she spoke. "Is she going to be okay?" Michael hesitated, glancing down at the stranger. The way her lashes fluttered against pale, fevered cheeks, the way her breath hitched in her sleep, her body curled into itself like she was used to bracing against something unseen. "I don't know, kid," he admitted. Lily shifted, chewing her lip. "She looks sad," she whispered, as if the woman could hear her even in sleep. Michael didn't have an answer for that, but when he looked at her again, really looked, he couldn't shake the feeling that Lily was right. The storm had settled into a steady drizzle by the time Michael finished making up the couch. The rain tapped softly against the windows, the house quiet, except for the occasional creak of the old wood beneath his feet. Isabella, if that was even her real name, lay motionless beneath the thick quilt he'd pulled from the linen closet. Her skin still looked pale, but her breathing had evened out, the worst of her shivering finally subsiding. Michael exhaled, running a hand over his face. He should have taken her to the hospital, no matter how much she protested. He didn't know who she was, where she came from, or why she'd been wandering in the freezing rain with nothing but an expensive coat and a fever that nearly knocked her out. But he did know one thing: she was hiding something. He didn't trust mysteries. Life had already dealt him enough uncertainty. As if sensing his thoughts, Isabella stirred, her lashes fluttering before her eyes finally opened. For a second, she just stared at the ceiling, disoriented. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward him, blinking sluggishly as if trying to place where she was. Michael folded his arms across his chest. "You awake enough to talk now?" She swallowed, wincing slightly, then nodded. "Where am I?" Her voice was still weak, but clearer than before. "My house," he answered. "You were half frozen on the side of the road. What the hell were you doing out there?" A shadow crossed her face, so fast he almost missed it. She shifted, struggling to sit up, but her body betrayed her, too weak to hold its own weight. He stepped forward instinctively, but she shook her head, forcing herself upright with trembling arms. "I just need to rest," she murmured. "I'll be gone in the morning." Michael narrowed his eyes. "That's not an answer." Isabella met his gaze then, her expression guarded. "I don't need answers, I just need time." The way she said it, firm, almost rehearsed, made his gut twist. She was used to this, used to shutting people out, used to running. Michael sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You got family? Someone I should call?" She hesitated just for a second. "No." A lie. He could hear it in the way her voice barely wavered. His jaw tightened. Everything about this screamed bad idea, keeping her here, getting involved. He had enough on his plate: Lily, work, barely keeping their lives together. The last thing he needed was a stranger with secrets bleeding into his already fragile world. But he also knew he wasn't the kind of man who could kick someone out in this condition. "Fine," he muttered. "Get some sleep. But in the morning, you tell me what's really going on." Isabella didn't respond. She just pulled the quilt tighter around herself, as if shielding whatever truth she carried. Michael watched her for a moment longer, then shook his head and turned off the light. Something told him he'd regret this. The night dragged on, thick with silence and the low hum of the rain against the windows. Michael sat at the edge of the couch, elbows resting on his knees, eyes locked on the woman shivering beneath the quilt. Isabella's face was pale, her skin damp with sweat, despite the cool air in the room. Every few minutes her breath hitched, her body trembling from fever. He ran a hand down his face, exhaustion pressing against his bones. He should be in bed, getting at least a few hours of rest before another grueling day at the shop. But every time he tried to look away, to convince himself that she would be fine until morning, another weak, pained breath escaped her lips, and he was right back at her side. She looked so fragile. It didn't make sense. Someone with her kind of clothes, her kind of presence. She wasn't the type of person who ended up helpless on a back road in the middle of a storm. And yet, here she was, alone, sick, vulnerable. Michael sighed, standing up and heading toward the kitchen. He rummaged through the cabinets, searching for something, anything, that might help. Half a bottle of aspirin, some tea bags shoved in the back of a drawer, the last of the honey Lily liked to mix into her oatmeal. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. By the time he returned to the couch, Isabella was stirring, her face twisted in discomfort. Her eyes fluttered open, barely, her lashes damp with fever. "You still with me?" Michael muttered, kneeling beside her. She blinked sluggishly, her gaze unfocused. "Where?" "You're still here," he said, keeping his voice low. "You've got a hell of a fever?" Isabella swallowed, her throat working painfully. She shifted like she wanted to sit up, but he caught her shoulder before she could. "Hey, don't! You need to stay down." She let out a shaky breath, and for the first time since he'd found her, her walls cracked just enough for something raw to slip through. Fear, helplessness, the kind of exhaustion that ran deeper than just being sick. Michael grabbed the damp cloth he'd left on the coffee table and pressed it gently to her forehead. She flinched at first, then exhaled, her body melting back into the couch as if the smallest bit of relief had drained the fight out of her. "I don't..." her voice barely carried, weak and broken. "I don't want to be a problem." Michael huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Too late for that. A ghost of something almost like amusement flickered in her fevered eyes before exhaustion pulled her back under. Michael leaned back against the couch, rubbing his temples. He should have ignored that damn rainstorm, should have kept driving. But now she was here, and somehow he already knew he wasn't walking away from this. The smell of pancakes filled the small house, warm and sweet, cutting through the lingering chill of the previous night. The scent pulled Isabella from the depths of restless sleep, her body aching but lighter than before. For a long moment she lay there, staring up at the ceiling, disoriented. The fever had broken. She inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the thick quilt draped over her, the unfamiliar couch beneath her, the warmth of a space that didn't belong to her. It took a second for her mind to piece together the memories, rain, exhaustion, headlights cutting through the storm, a man with kind but wary eyes, a little girl with the softest voice. Michael. A sound from the kitchen made her tense, a quiet giggle, followed by the scrape of a chair against the floor. Isabella turned her head, her body sluggish, her limbs still weak. Through the archway she could just make out the sight of Lily, perched at the kitchen table, her tiny legs swinging beneath the chair. Michael stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with the kind of practiced ease that told her he'd done this 100 times before. Lily was talking, fast and excited, words tumbling over each other in the way children spoke when they had too many thoughts and not enough time to share them. Isabella couldn't hear everything, but she caught snippets. Something about a dream she had, something about pancakes shaped like bears, and then, clear as day, "Is she a princess?" Michael let out a quiet sigh, shaking his head as he set a plate of pancakes in front of her. "Not every lady in a fancy dress is a princess, kid," Lily huffed, stabbing at her pancake with her fork. "She looks like one." Isabella smiled faintly, shifting to sit up. The movement sent a dull ache through her limbs, but she ignored it. Carefully, she swung her legs over the side of the couch. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, and instantly Michael's jacket, the one he had draped over her the night before, fell into her lap. She ran her fingers over the worn fabric, something tight pressing in her chest. The moment she stepped into the kitchen, Lily's eyes lit up. "You're awake!" Isabella offered a small smile, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I am." Michael turned from the stove, arms crossing over his chest as he took her in. She could see the questions behind his eyes, the hesitation still lurking in his stance. He didn't trust her. Not yet. She couldn't blame him. "How are you feeling?" he asked, voice neutral. Isabella hesitated, glancing at the little girl who was watching her like she was something out of a fairy tale. She forced herself to stand taller, smoothing down the fabric of her coat. "Better," she said, "thanks to you." Michael didn't react, just studied her carefully. "You hungry?" Her stomach twisted, a painful reminder of just how long it had been since she'd eaten. But hunger was nothing new, neither was exhaustion. Still, Lily beamed, motioning to the chair beside her. "Daddy makes the best pancakes." Isabella hesitated, but Lily's excitement was impossible to ignore. Slowly, she pulled out the chair, lowering herself into it. Michael set a plate in front of her. "Eat," he said simply. She picked up the fork, a small, unfamiliar warmth settling in her chest. It had been a long time since anyone had made her breakfast, a long time since she had sat in a kitchen that felt like a home. She took a bite, the flavors rich and comforting, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself breathe. The warmth of the kitchen wrapped around Isabella, a stark contrast to the bitter cold that had nearly swallowed her the night before. She sat at the small, worn wooden table, the scent of maple syrup lingering in the air. Across from her, Lily chattered between bites, her excitement filling the quiet space like sunlight pushing through storm clouds. Michael, however, was silent. He sat at the other end of the table, sipping his coffee, watching her the way a man watches something he doesn't quite trust. Not with open hostility, but with the kind of careful skepticism that came from someone who'd been burned before. Isabella had spent most of her life surrounded by people who wanted something: deals, favors, power. She knew the language of expectation better than she knew herself, and yet, as she sat there sipping coffee from a chipped mug, listening to Lily ramble about cartoons and school, she couldn't find any of that in Michael. No expectations, no ulterior motives, just quiet, unwavering presence. It unsettled her. She cleared her throat, setting her fork down. "Thank you," she said softly, looking directly at Michael, "for everything." Michael shrugged, not looking at her. "Wasn't going to leave you in the cold." It was such a simple thing, but the weight of it landed heavy in her chest. She exhaled, reaching into the pocket of her coat. The moment her fingers brushed the smooth surface of her credit card, some of that unease settled. This was what she knew. She pulled it out, setting it on the table. "At least let me pay you for the trouble." Michael's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered to the card, then back to her. "No." It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't polite refusal. It was firm, immediate, absolute. Isabella straightened slightly. "I can afford it." "I don't care," Michael said, his voice steady. "I didn't help you for money." She stared at him, trying to process that. It was absurd, really. In her world, everything had a price. Nothing came without strings. Lily watched them both, swinging her legs beneath the chair. "Daddy doesn't take money from people," she announced, as if it was a well-known fact of life. Michael sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Eat your pancakes, kid." Isabella hesitated, her fingers curling slightly against the table's rough surface. She should push. She should insist. But something about the way Michael was looking at her, steady, unflinching, unmoved, made her stop. She slid the card back into her pocket. She didn't understand this man. But for the first time in a long, long time, she wanted to. Michael didn't trust mysteries, and the woman sitting at his kitchen table was nothing but one. She held her coffee with both hands, fingers wrapped around the chipped ceramic like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She was still pale, exhaustion still clinging to her like an unwanted shadow. But there was something else beneath the surface, something she was trying to keep hidden. Michael had spent his life around people who had to work for everything they had. The kind who drove the same truck for 20 years because they couldn't afford a new one. The kind who counted every dollar at the grocery store. The kind who fixed things instead of replacing them. Isabella wasn't one of those people. It was in the details, the way she sat, spine straight, movements calculated, the way her voice carried just enough careful restraint, as if she was used to controlling conversations without even trying. And then there were the things she couldn't hide, like the watch on her wrist. It was sleek, expensive, the kind of brand he'd only seen in magazines left behind at the shop's waiting area. Her coat, too. Even after being soaked through, the fabric was high-end, the stitching too precise to be anything off a department store rack. Michael took another sip of coffee, studying her from across the table. She didn't belong here. Not in this kitchen, not in this town, not wrapped in one of his old blankets, like she was something fragile. So why the hell had she been stranded in the rain, looking like she'd run straight out of a life no one in this town could afford? Lily, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface, leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands. "Are you a princess?" Isabella blinked, startled. "What?" Lily pointed at her watch. "Only princesses wear stuff like that." Michael expected Isabella to laugh, to brush it off. Instead, something flickered in her expression, too fast to catch, but real enough to make her grip the coffee mug a little tighter. "No," she said softly, eyes dropping to the table. "I'm not a princess." Lily frowned. "Then who are you?" Michael leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?" For a second she didn't answer. Then, slowly, she lifted her gaze to meet his. And for the first time since he found her on that road, Michael saw it, hesitation. Not the kind that came from lying. The kind that came from not knowing if the truth was safe anymore. The truck rumbled down the road, the hum of the engine filling the silence between them. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world washed clean, but the clouds still loomed overhead, heavy and gray. Michael kept one hand on the wheel, the other tapping absently against his thigh, as he glanced at Isabella out of the corner of his eye. She sat stiffly in the passenger seat, staring out at the empty stretch of highway ahead, her expression unreadable. He didn't know why, but the air between them felt heavier than it should have, like there was something pressing down on her shoulders that had nothing to do with last night's fever. "You sure this is where you need to go?" he asked, breaking the silence. Isabella turned her head slightly, studying him for a moment before nodding. "Yes." Michael didn't believe her. She hadn't given him an address, just a vague direction toward the city. He didn't know what waited for her there, but something told him she wasn't in a rush to get back to it. He let out a slow breath, adjusting his grip on the wheel. "You got someone worried about you?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No." "Family?" Another pause, this time longer. "Not the kind that notices when I'm gone." Michael frowned, but didn't push. He knew the feeling all too well. For a few miles they drove in silence. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the city skyline barely visible in the distance. Finally, Isabella spoke, her voice quieter now. "What about you?" Michael raised an eyebrow. "What about me?" "You and Lily," she said. "It's just the two of you?" He nodded. "Been that way since her mom left." Isabella didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was softer than before. "That must be hard." Michael huffed out a dry laugh. "That's one way to put it." She turned her gaze back to the window, watching as the landscape they blurred past. "Why do you do it?" Michael shot her a sideways glance. "Do what?" "Keep going, keep working yourself to the bone. You don't have to fix every problem that crosses your path, but you do anyway." Something about the way she said it made his chest tighten. He focused on the road, jaw tightening slightly. "Because that's what you do," he finally said. "When someone needs you, you show up. Doesn't matter how hard it is. Doesn't matter if it's fair or not." Isabella swallowed, her fingers tightening in her lap. "Not everyone thinks like that," Michael sighed, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, maybe more people should." For the first time since they got in the truck, Isabella looked at him, really looked at him. There was something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite name, gratitude, maybe even understanding. Whatever it was, it settled deep in his chest, leaving behind a feeling that wasn't entirely unwelcome. The city unfolded before them, glass towers rising against the storm-heavy sky, the streets alive with the restless energy of early morning traffic. Michael had always hated coming here. Too many cars, too many people moving too fast, like they had somewhere more important to be, like they couldn't see the world around them. He pulled the truck up in front of the hotel Isabella had finally murmured directions to. It was massive, sleek glass, a revolving door that never seemed to stop spinning, and men in sharp suits moving with purpose across the marble lobby just beyond the entrance. Yeah, she didn't belong in his world. She belonged here. Michael shifted into park and glanced at her, but she was already reaching for the door handle, moving too quickly, like she was desperate to put distance between herself and the past few hours. The past night, the past moment in the truck that had felt dangerously like something real. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Hey." Isabella froze, gripping the handle but not opening the door. Michael ran a hand through his hair. "Are you?" He stopped himself. What was he even asking? If she was okay? If she needed anything else? If this, whatever the hell this was, meant something, she wouldn't answer, and he already knew it. Before he could say anything else, a voice cut through the street noise. "Miss Sinclair?" Michael barely had time to process the name before a uniformed hotel staff member approached, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. "We've been trying to reach you," the man continued. "Your assistant, your security team, everyone's been looking for you." The world around them seemed to snap into place, sharp and clear. Michael turned to Isabella slowly, his pulse a steady thud in his ears. "Sinclair?" His own voice sounded foreign to him, as in, "Isabella Sinclair?" She swallowed hard, the color draining from her face. Michael let out a breathless laugh, but there was no humor in it. The watch, the coat, the way she carried herself. He'd known she was hiding something, but this was something else entirely. Michael felt the weight of the name settle over him like a lead brick, pressing down hard on his chest. Isabella Sinclair. The name alone carried enough power to turn heads, to command entire boardrooms, to be splashed across the front pages of business magazines. And yet she had been lying half dead in a ditch last night, wearing his jacket, sitting at his kitchen table like she belonged in his world. His grip tightened around the steering wheel. "You gotta be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. Isabella turned to him, her eyes pleading, her expression guarded. "Michael! No!" He let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "No, you don't get to say my name like that. Not now. Not after—" He cut himself off, jaw clenching. He didn't even know what he was about to say. After what? After she sat in his truck, like a lost soul searching for something she couldn't name? After she let his daughter believe she was some kind of storybook mystery, instead of a billionaire who could have bought their entire town without blinking? The staff member hovered a few steps away, clearly unsure if he should stay or go. Michael didn't care. "So what was it, huh?" His voice was quieter now, but it was edged with something raw, something bitter. Some kind of experiment? See how the other half lives? A game? Isabella flinched. "It wasn't like that." Michael scoffed, shoving a hand through his hair. "Then what the hell was it?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. "And that was the answer, wasn't it?" Michael exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You know what? I don't care. You don't owe me an explanation, and I don't need one." He reached across her, pulling the door handle, pushing it open. "Go back to your world, Sinclair." For a split second she didn't move, and for a split second he hated the way something in her eyes looked like regret. Then she stepped out, and just like that, whatever had been between them was gone. Michael stood at the back of the garage, his hands covered in grease, the familiar scent of motor oil and worn-out tools surrounding him like a comfort. The day had been long, and the work had been slow, but it was what he knew, what he had always known. The sound of tires rolling over gravel outside made him glance up. He didn't need to look to know who it was. Isabella's sleek car pulled to a stop just outside the shop, the engine purring to a halt with that unmistakable hum of something far more expensive than anything he would ever own. He wiped his hands on a rag, tossing it aside. As he walked toward the door, she stepped out, looking more at ease here than she had at the hotel. She wore a simple black dress that still managed to exude a quiet elegance, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. But there was something different in her expression today, something that made the air between them feel tense, charged. "Isabella," Michael said, his voice tight, "what are you doing here?" She took a few steps toward him, stopping just short of the workbench where he stood, arms crossed. "I wanted to talk." He raised an eyebrow, already feeling his patience slipping. "About what?" Her eyes softened, but there was something calculating behind them, something he couldn't quite read. "About this." She gestured around the garage, taking in the cluttered workbenches, the faded posters on the walls, the cracked concrete floor. Michael frowned, his chest tightening. "What about it?" She hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "This place, Michael, it's falling apart. You're barely getting by." The words hit harder than she realized. He didn't need anyone to point out the obvious. The bills stacked up on his kitchen counter, the hours he worked just to keep his daughter fed, the shop that used to be full of life, now just another place that was slowly dying. "I'm fine," he said, his voice gruff. "I don't need charity." Isabella's gaze flickered briefly with something that looked like sympathy, but she pressed on. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a way out. I can help you fix this. Fix your shop. You don't have to keep struggling." Michael's jaw clenched. "I didn't ask for your help." She stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not offering it to make you feel weak. I'm offering it because I believe in what you're doing here. You're good at this, Michael. You just need a chance to show it to the right people." He shook his head, anger flaring inside him. "I don't need a handout from you or anyone else. I built this on my own. I'll keep it that way." Isabella's expression tightened, but she didn't give up. "Your pride is the only thing standing in your way. You're barely getting by. What's the harm in accepting help?" Michael stepped back, his eyes burning with frustration. "The harm is that I don't need pity, Isabella. I don't need you to swoop in and save me." For a long moment they just stood there, the weight of the tension between them thick and suffocating. Finally, Isabella exhaled, a quiet resignation settling over her features. "I'm not trying to save you, Michael. I'm just trying to give you a shot. But if you won't take it, that's on you." She turned and walked toward her car without another word, leaving Michael standing there, his heart pounding in his chest, his pride bruised but unwavering. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the small town as it prepared for the annual festival. Michael had always hated the hustle of the event, the crowded streets, the noise, the clamor of 1,000 voices all vying for attention. But Lily, she loved it. Every year she counted down the days, her excitement growing with each passing minute. "Daddy, can we go to the festival now?" she asked for the third time that afternoon, her face beaming with the kind of pure joy only a child could possess. Michael glanced up from the workbench where he was fiddling with an old carburetor, wiping his hands on a rag. The sound of the festivities drifting through the open windows was enough to make him grimace. It wasn't that he didn't want Lily to enjoy herself. It was just that he knew the money they'd spend there would barely cover a few bills. But seeing her face, seeing the excitement and hope in her wide eyes, made it hard to say no. "All right, kiddo. We'll go," he muttered, standing up and stretching the tension from his back. "But only for a little while, okay? We still have work to do." Lily's eyes lit up, and she ran over to the door, tugging on his sleeve with more enthusiasm than he could ever muster. "Can I invite Miss Isabella?" Michael froze, his stomach sinking. He hadn't expected Isabella to still be around. She had come and gone so quickly, just like everything else about her. But something about the way she carried herself lingered in his mind. "I don't think she'd be interested in that, sweetheart," he said carefully, feeling a strange mix of frustration and uncertainty tighten in his chest. But Lily was already bouncing on her toes, oblivious to the unspoken tension. "But she said she liked the carnival rides when we talked. I think she'd like to come." Before Michael could respond, Lily darted to the kitchen where Isabella was sitting, flipping through a magazine she'd found on the coffee table. "Miss Isabella, do you want to come to the festival with us? It's tonight, and there's going to be a Ferris wheel and cotton candy. It's so much fun." Isabella looked up from the page she was staring at, her lips curving into a faint, unsure smile. For a moment she didn't speak, just glanced between Lily's eager face and Michael, standing at the doorway with his arms folded. Michael opened his mouth to say something, anything, but stopped when Isabella nodded slowly. "Why not?" she said, her voice soft. "I've never seen a small-town festival before. It could be interesting." Lily's excitement was immediate, her arms flinging around Isabella in a tight hug. "Yay! I'm so happy!" she cheered. As Isabella stood up and followed Lily toward the door, Michael couldn't help but feel a knot form in his gut. He had no idea what Isabella was looking for in this town, or why she'd agreed to join them. But seeing her try to fit into this world, to be part of something so simple and real, made the weight in his chest feel heavier than ever. And as they walked outside together with Lily skipping ahead, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had begun between them was about to change. The evening air was warm, and the scent of fried food and sugar wafted through the streets as the festival came alive. The music from a nearby band echoed across the town square, blending with the laughter and chatter of people mingling by the booths. For a brief moment, Michael could almost forget about the mounting bills, the shop falling apart, and the life he was barely holding together. Here, in the middle of this chaotic celebration, everything seemed a little brighter, a little easier. Lily's hand was in his, her grip tight with excitement, her eyes wide as she darted from one colorful tent to the next, dragging him along with her. He couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. But it was Isabella who caught his attention, standing a few steps behind, looking out of place in her expensive dress and perfectly styled hair, yet somehow strangely out of place in the best way. She was watching the crowd, observing, taking in everything with wide, curious eyes. The contrast was impossible to miss. Isabella Sinclair, a billionaire with the world at her feet, standing in the middle of a small-town festival, dressed in heels that didn't belong in a place like this. But as she watched the kids running around laughing as they spun in circles, and the older couples strolling hand in hand through the carnival lights, Michael saw something shift in her expression, something that made her look more human than she had ever seemed before. "Look, Daddy, the Ferris wheel!" Lily's voice cut through his thoughts, her excitement pulling him back to the moment. Isabella stepped closer, her gaze following the direction of Lily's pointed finger. She hesitated for a moment, glancing at Michael. Her lips parted as if she wasn't sure how to react. But when she spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "It looks beautiful." The Ferris wheel was lit up, the colors vibrant against the darkening sky, and the laughter of children blended with the carnival music in a melody of happiness. Michael felt the weight of the moment, watching Isabella with new eyes. There was something about her now, something that wasn't about money or status, but about the simple joy of the moment. He led them toward the ride, his hand still firmly holding Lily's. Isabella trailed behind, more hesitant now, but there was a softness in her step. When they reached the line, Lily jumped excitedly, her small hands grabbing Isabella's arm. "Please, Miss Isabella, you have to come with us." Isabella looked down at the little girl, her face softening into a genuine smile. "Okay," she said quietly, nodding. "I'll go." As they climbed into the small gondola and it began its slow ascent into the sky, Michael felt something stir deep within him. The tension between him and Isabella, the distance that had always felt too great, began to fade. They weren't worlds apart tonight, not here, not in this moment. As the Ferris wheel reached its peak and they looked out over the town with the lights of the festival below and the stars above, Isabella let out a soft laugh, a sound that felt almost foreign but incredibly real. She looked at him, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that caught him off guard. For the first time, Michael didn't see her as the woman with the expensive watch or the billionaire who could change everything with a phone call. He saw her as something else entirely. A woman just like him, caught up in a moment that felt pure, untethered from the weight of the world. And in that instant, Michael realized how much he had wanted this. To share something real, to feel connected, to know that in the midst of all the struggle, there was a space for something more, something that didn't come with strings attached. For a brief, shining moment, everything felt right. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. Michael stood at the kitchen counter, absently stirring his coffee, trying to shake the weight of the night before. The festival had been a temporary escape, a fleeting glimpse into a world that didn't belong to him, didn't belong to Isabella either, not really. She had been different, more alive, as if something in her had been awakened by the laughter, the simplicity of it all. But now, as the sun rose and the town settled back into its usual rhythm, so did the reality that she didn't belong here, not in this town, not in his world. He heard her footsteps behind him, light but steady. Shiora had been up for a while, packing her things, preparing for the moment that had been hanging between them like an unspoken promise. "I'll be going soon," Isabella said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure if he was even listening. Michael's grip tightened on his mug, the warmth of it offering little comfort. He turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers. "I figured." She stepped into the kitchen, glancing at the countertop where she had spent the last few hours, her jacket folded neatly, her bag packed. There was something about the way she moved, something detached, like she had already checked out mentally. But there was still a tension between them, thick and heavy, lingering like smoke that wouldn't clear. "I didn't expect to stay this long," she said, her gaze flickering away from his, as if she didn't want to see whatever was in his eyes. Michael exhaled slowly, the weight of last night still pressing on him. "Then why did you?" She paused, running her fingers over the edge of the countertop, her eyes lowering. "I don't know." There it was again, the honesty, the vulnerability that had crept through when they had shared the Ferris wheel ride, the laughter under the stars. But now that same openness was fading, slipping away, leaving behind the barriers they had both put up. "I don't know if I'm ready to walk away from this," she admitted, barely above a whisper. Michael's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time in days, he felt something stir deep inside him. It was the unspoken what-if between them, the possibility of something more, something real, that they both danced around but never touched. "You don't have to leave," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He cursed himself immediately, but it was too late. He had said it. Isabella's gaze shot up, her eyes wide, searching his face for any sign that he meant it. But before either of them could say anything more, the silence was broken by the sound of Lily's voice from the hallway, calling out that she was ready for breakfast. The moment was gone, dissipating as quickly as it had arrived, leaving them standing in the quiet aftermath. Isabella grabbed her bag and slung it over her shoulder. "I'll be in touch," she said, her voice softer now, almost like an apology. Michael nodded, unable to find the words to say what he was feeling. It wasn't anger, wasn't frustration. It was the strange ache of knowing that something had almost happened between them, but now it was slipping away, out of reach. She reached for the door, hesitated, and turned back. "Thank you for everything, Michael. For last night. For—" She trailed off, not finishing the sentence, but the meaning was clear. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Take care of yourself, Isabella." And just like that, she was gone, and the door clicked shut behind her, leaving Michael standing alone, wondering if he had just let the best thing he'd had in a long time slip away without even knowing how to hold on. The shop was as quiet as it always was in the mornings, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights above and the distant sound of traffic outside. Michael's hands worked mechanically, the motions familiar, comforting even. But today the weight of his thoughts felt heavier than the grease and metal he'd grown used to. His mind kept drifting back to Isabella. He had tried to push it down, to focus on the work at hand, but it lingered like a shadow that wouldn't leave. The way she had looked at him before she left, her eyes soft, her smile distant, like she was carrying something heavy that she couldn't share. She had given him the briefest glimpse of herself, vulnerable, unsure, and then disappeared, just like everything else he'd ever wanted but couldn't have. Michael let out a frustrated breath as he tightened a bolt on a car engine. His mind wouldn't stop. The way she had walked through his small-town streets, awkward but still there, as if she was trying to fit into a world that wasn't hers. And the way she had laughed, her eyes lighting up when Lily had pulled her into the festival's chaos, when she had let herself be part of something real. "Come on, man," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "Focus." But it wasn't working. The smell of fresh coffee from the break room reminded him of mornings with Lily, sitting together at the kitchen table, talking about anything and everything. It reminded him that he couldn't afford distractions, not now. There were bills to pay, repairs to make, a daughter who needed him to keep it all together. But Isabella was still there. He wiped his hands on a rag, turning toward the break room for a moment of quiet. He leaned against the counter, staring at the cup in his hands, but his mind was still miles away. He could still feel her presence, even though she wasn't here. He could still hear her soft laugh, see the way she had looked at him. Across the table, a look full of questions he couldn't answer. The sound of the door opening broke his thoughts, and he turned to see Lily standing there, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her face bright with excitement. She'd been talking about the festival all morning, about the rides and the lights, and how Isabella had looked so happy when they'd been on the Ferris wheel together. "Daddy, can we go again next year?" she asked, her eyes wide. Michael forced a smile, setting the mug down on the counter. "Yeah, kiddo, we'll go next year." But even as the words left his mouth, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something in him had shifted, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't push it away. Isabella's presence, even in her absence, was like a weight he couldn't escape. And as the day dragged on, the distance between him and the life he thought he knew seemed just a little bit wider. The sound of the knock on the door startled Michael, pulling him from the monotony of his work. His eyes flickered toward the clock on the wall, the second hand ticking slowly as the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the grimy windows of the shop. It had been a quiet day, the kind where he found himself lost in the hum of machines and the weight of thoughts he couldn't shake. He wiped his hands on a rag before walking over to the door, half expecting another customer with a busted car, but instead, a man in a crisp suit stood there, his briefcase in hand. The contrast between the well-dressed stranger and the worn-out mechanic standing before him couldn't have been more stark. "Mr. Carter?" the man asked, his tone polite but businesslike. "Yeah, who's asking?" Michael replied, a flicker of wariness rising in his chest. "My name is Trevor Miller. I'm a business consultant sent by Miss Isabella Sinclair." Michael's stomach tightened at the mention of her name, the memories of their last conversation still fresh. He stepped aside to let the man in, trying to ignore the way his heart seemed to race despite himself. He hadn't seen her since she left, and now this stranger showing up with business talk. Trevor Miller wasted no time. He placed his briefcase on the counter, flipping it open with precise movements. "Miss Sinclair believes you have potential. She wants to help you expand your shop into a top-tier auto service center. We've already done a preliminary evaluation, and there's a clear opportunity for growth." Michael's mind raced, his thoughts tumbling over each other. He hadn't expected this, not from someone like her, someone who lived in a world of polished suits and high-rise offices. She'd offered him help before, but this was something entirely different. "Expand?" Michael repeated, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. "I've been doing this on my own for years. I don't need anyone swooping in, trying to change things." Trevor looked up, his eyes steady. "It's not about changing your business, Mr. Carter. It's about giving it the resources it deserves. We're talking about upgrading equipment, bringing in experienced staff, reaching more clients. Miss Sinclair believes in what you're doing here. She thinks you could run one of the best auto centers in the area." Michael's throat went dry. He wasn't sure if he was more shocked by the offer itself or by the fact that someone, especially someone like Isabella, believed in him. He ran his hand through his hair, trying to clear his head. "You don't understand," Michael said, his voice low. "This place, it's all I've got. My shop, my daughter, this life, it's been hard enough as it is. I've fought for every damn thing I've got. I don't know what kind of deal you're talking about, but I don't want to owe anyone anything, not like that." Trevor studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I understand, Mr. Carter, but you're not alone in this. You'll have full control. This is about giving you the chance to grow without sacrificing what's important." Michael stood there, his mind in turmoil. He was tired of struggling, tired of barely scraping by. The idea of having more, of seeing something he'd worked so hard for finally thrive, was tempting. But the thought of accepting help, especially from someone like Isabella, who had never really understood his world, felt like a betrayal of everything he'd built. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice distant, though his mind was already racing with possibilities. Trevor smiled, closing his briefcase. "Take your time. Miss Sinclair expects a response soon." As the man walked out, Michael stood there, his heart pounding. The offer was too big to ignore, and yet something in him, something deep and raw, told him that accepting it might change everything, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for that. The morning was still cold, the fog hanging thick over the streets as Michael opened the shop for another day. His hands were already stiff from the cold, but he pushed through, already focused on the list of repairs that needed to be done. He didn't mind the work. It was familiar, comfortable. But today something felt different, a shift in the air he couldn't shake. It wasn't until later, when he was elbow-deep in an engine, that he heard the first whisper, "Hey, Carter, got a minute?" Michael turned to see Tom, his rival mechanic, standing by the door, his arms crossed. Tom was younger, cockier, and he'd never been shy about making his feelings known. Michael didn't like the look on his face. "What's up?" Michael asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Tom's smirk was almost predatory. "I heard some interesting news." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Heard you're getting a little too big for your britches. Heard you're selling out." Michael frowned, confused. "What the hell are you talking about?" Tom leaned in, lowering his voice. "You know, that little deal you're cooking up with Sinclair? I hear she's got big plans for your shop, plans that don't involve you working the same garage you've been stuck in for years." Michael's gut tightened. He could feel his blood pressure rising, his pulse quickening. "That's none of your business," he snapped, trying to push the rising frustration down. But Tom wasn't done. "You really think people won't notice? A guy like you, working out of this dump, suddenly getting all this fancy equipment, hiring some high-priced crew to run your shop? You think they won't see right through you?" Michael's hands gripped the workbench, the wrench in his hand digging into the metal as his thoughts raced. The words Tom was saying weren't just insults. They were a challenge, an accusation. And for the first time, Michael found himself questioning everything. The shop had been his life, his pride, his battle. Every day spent fixing cars, getting his hands dirty, scraping by. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his. And now, here was Tom, a man who'd never worked as hard as Michael, trying to tear that down with nothing but rumors and petty jealousy. "Don't listen to me," Tom continued, his grin widening. "But when people start talking, you're going to wish you had." Michael stood there frozen, the weight of the words settling in, like stones in his chest. He hadn't considered what it would look like if he took the deal with Isabella, if he allowed her to turn his small-town shop into something more. He hadn't considered what it would mean for the people who had always known him as the mechanic who never sold out. Tom left the shop, but the damage was already done. The doubts gnawed at him. Would the community see him as a sellout? Was he really willing to risk everything he'd worked for, everything that made him who he was, for the chance to expand? He slammed the hood of the car shut, his mind racing. The decision, once so clear, suddenly felt impossible. Was he really ready to let go of the life he had built, the one that was flawed but real, for something bigger that might not fit into the world he knew? The noise of the shop faded as Michael's thoughts spiraled, the certainty he'd felt earlier slipping away. The man in the mirror was no longer so sure of who he was or what he wanted. Michael was elbow-deep in oil when the sound of the shop door creaking open reached his ears. He barely looked up, assuming it was another customer, or maybe one of the regulars dropping by to chat. The shop was slow today, and his mind was still tangled in the mess of decisions and accusations that had been haunting him all week. But then he heard it, her voice. "Michael?" His heart lurched before he could even stop it. He knew that voice. Isabella. The last person he expected to see, and yet somehow the one he couldn't stop thinking about. He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag, his gaze catching hers as she stood just inside the door, and she looked the same, elegant, composed. But there was something in the way she stood there, something different in her posture, like she was uncertain about how to approach him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the weight of everything that had happened, the confusion, the hurt, the promises made and broken, hung between them in the thick, humid air of the garage. Michael couldn't help but feel the tension coil in his chest. But there was something else, too, something pulling at him, something that told him he wasn't done with her yet. "Isabella," he finally said, his voice tight, "what are you doing here?" She stepped forward, her eyes soft but determined. "I came to talk," she said, her voice low. "I need you to listen." Michael didn't move. "You've made your offer. I've made mine. What else is there to say?" Isabella shook her head, the faintest flicker of frustration crossing her features. "It's not about the deal, Michael. It never was. It's about you." She paused, as if gathering her thoughts. "I know you think I'm just some rich woman coming in to take over your life, but I'm not. I'm trying to help." He laughed bitterly, the sound sharp in the quiet space. "Help? By offering me money? By telling me I need to change everything I've worked for? By showing up like you own the place?" "I'm not trying to control you," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion creeping in. I just want to help someone who deserves it. Someone who's been doing things the hard way because that's all they know." "You're a good man, Michael. You've built something from nothing. You deserve more than this." Michael swallowed hard, the words scraping at his throat. It was hard to hear her say it, hard to let someone else see the cracks in his world, the flaws he'd worked so hard to hide. "I don't need your help, Isabella," he said, the words coming out in a rush, as though to protect himself. "I've gotten by just fine." She took another step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "But you're not fine, Michael. You're barely scraping by. You're fighting battles you don't have to fight alone anymore." Her voice softened, becoming almost pleading. "Please, trust me. Let me help you. Let me help you fix this. You don't have to keep carrying this weight by yourself." The silence between them was thick, heavy, with the unspoken truth hanging in the air. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, and for the first time he let himself admit that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to do it all alone. But the fear of losing control, fear of losing everything he had fought for, was still there, still clawing at him. "I'm not asking for everything," she said, her voice almost a whisper now. "Just a chance." Michael didn't know how long they stood there, locked in that moment, the noise of the shop distant and irrelevant. But as he looked into her eyes, the hesitation inside him began to fade, replaced by something he couldn't name, something dangerous, and yet something that felt like the beginning of something new. Isabella sat in the sleek conference room, the sharp lines of the glass walls reflecting the tension in the air. The room was filled with the kind of people who had been in charge of things their whole lives, people who knew how to make decisions with cold precision without considering the human cost. She had always hated this part of the job, the cold strategy, the polished smiles that never quite reached their eyes. But today, it was different. Today, the walls seemed to close in on her, their voices growing louder, more insistent. "Isabella," Thomas Green, the head of the board, said, his voice laced with annoyance. This thing with Michael Carter is becoming a problem." Her stomach dropped. She had been expecting this, but hearing it out loud still stung. "I don't see how helping a small-town mechanic grow his business is a problem," Isabella replied, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. "He has potential, and I'm offering him an opportunity. Why is that such a threat?" Green leaned forward, his fingers tapping on the sleek surface of the table, his gaze cold and calculating. "Because he's a distraction. And this—" he waved a hand dismissively in the air. "This isn't part of the plan. You're supposed to be expanding Sinclair Enterprises, not playing savior for some mechanic." Isabella's jaw tightened, but she held her ground. "Michael Carter isn't just a mechanic, Thomas. He's a good man. He deserves a chance, just like anyone else." One of the other board members, a woman with dark, calculating eyes, chimed in. "What's the long-term vision here, Isabella? A few upgrades to his shop? That's hardly going to move the needle for the company. You're wasting resources on a dead-end project." Isabella's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. "You don't get it. Michael's shop isn't about the money. It's about something real, something I believe in. Maybe you all can't see that from your shiny offices, but I'm not going to turn my back on someone who actually deserves a chance to succeed." Green's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no humor in it. "You can't afford to get sentimental, Isabella. You're one of us now. You have to think bigger. This human element you're clinging to, it's going to cost you." The words hit harder than she expected. She had known deep down that this day would come, the day when they would push back against her personal choices, against what she truly believed in. But hearing them laid out like that, so coldly, made her blood run hot with anger. "I'm not asking for permission," she said, her voice firm, the steel in it cutting through the tension. "I will not abandon Michael. You can push me all you want, but I won't back down." Green's eyes narrowed. "Then you'll have to choose, Isabella. Sinclair Enterprises or this personal vendetta. You can't have both." The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket of cold ice. It was clear, if she didn't give in, if she didn't toe the line, they'd make her choice for her. The stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined, and the price of standing her ground might be losing everything she'd worked for. But as she sat there, listening to the hollow arguments of the people around her, her thoughts drifted back to Michael, the way he had looked at her when she had offered him her help, the way he believed in her when no one else did. She would not betray him, not now, not ever. "I'll take the risk," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm not giving up on Michael or this." And for the first time, Isabella realized she was ready to fight, not just for her career, but for something far more important, herself. Michael stood just outside the office door, his hand resting on the handle, the sound of muffled voices drifting through the cracked gap. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but when he'd heard Isabella's name, his heart had skipped a beat, the familiar knot tightening in his stomach. He wasn't sure what he expected to hear, but certainly not this. "She's not going to risk it all for some mechanic, is she?" The voice of a man, one of Isabella's colleagues maybe, drifted through. "I mean, Carter's not even a real business. It's a small-town garage." The tone was dismissive, condescending. "She can't be serious about this." Michael's breath caught in his throat. He shouldn't be listening. He should have walked away, but he couldn't move. His body was frozen, his mind racing as the conversation continued. "I think she likes the idea of saving him. It's sentimental," the woman's voice chimed in, dripping with irony. "But she has a company to run, and he's not exactly a smart investment. You know how she is. Too much heart, not enough head. I'm just saying if she doesn't drop him, she's going to regret it." "I can't believe she's even considering keeping him in the picture," the man responded. "Isabella doesn't belong in that world. And Michael Carter, he's a distraction, plain and simple. She'll either let him go, or she'll lose everything she's worked for." Every word hit Michael like a punch. His fists clenched at his sides, and his breath came out in short, sharp gasps. So this was it. This was the truth. Isabella was only playing at this, wasn't she? She was only trying to help him because it made her feel better, not because she actually believed in him. To her, he was just a charity case, a distraction from her big, important world. The door creaked behind him, and he snapped back to reality, his heart pounding as he quickly wiped his hands on his jeans, trying to shake the anger, the hurt that had already taken root. Isabella stepped out of the office, her eyes meeting his immediately. She seemed startled for a second, but her expression quickly shifted to one of guilt, regret even. "Michael," she started, but her voice faltered as she took a step toward him. "I can explain." "No," Michael cut her off, his voice low but sharp, the words coming out before he could stop them. He couldn't hear her right now, couldn't listen to more of her excuses. His chest ached too much. "I don't want to hear it," she frowned, taking another step toward him. "Michael, please." He shook his head, the bitterness creeping up his throat. "You were never serious about this, were you?" His voice broke, the anger and hurt bleeding into the words. "You just wanted to fix something, someone, and I was just your latest project, right? Just some little mechanic to make you feel good about yourself." "No, that's not—" She reached out for him, but he stepped back, and the space between them widening. "You don't get it, Isabella," he said, his voice shaking now, the rawness seeping through. I thought you saw something in me, something worth fighting for, but I'm not some damn charity case, and I'm not some lesson you can teach. I'm not your project. You've never had to work for anything in your life." The words spilled out faster now, the frustration and disbelief taking over. "So go back to your perfect life, your perfect world. It's what you really want, isn't it?" Isabella's eyes were wide, her mouth opening and closing, as if searching for words that could fix what had been said. But Michael couldn't stay. He couldn't listen to her anymore. He turned, walking away before the pain in his chest completely shattered him. The shop was silent, the sound of Michael's tools clinking against the workbench the only noise in the heavy air. He sat on a stool, his hands limp at his sides, the weight of everything pressing down on him. It had been days since he'd walked away from Isabella, but the sting of that moment hadn't faded. Every time he thought about her, about the look on her face when he'd turned his back on her, something twisted painfully in his chest. She was right. He'd let his pride destroy the one thing that could have been good. "Dad?" Michael turned sharply at the sound of Lily's voice, her small figure standing at the doorway of the shop, her face peeking around the corner. Her backpack was slung over one shoulder, but her eyes were filled with concern, her brow furrowed in the way it always was when she could tell something was wrong. "Hey, sweetie, what are you doing here?" He tried to force a smile, but it came out more strained than he intended. Lily walked into the room slowly, her small footsteps tentative. "I was worried about you." She paused, her eyes scanning his face, then stepped closer, her tiny hands reaching for his. "You look sad." Michael's throat tightened. He swallowed hard, pushing away the lump of emotion that had been building inside him since the moment he'd left Isabella behind. He couldn't let her see him like this, couldn't let her know how much he was hurting. She was just a little girl, too young to understand. "I'm just tired, kiddo," he said, his voice rough. "Nothing to worry about." Lily frowned, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him with more wisdom than a child should have. She stood there for a moment, then let go of his hand, walking around to stand in front of him. "You always tell me that kindness is never a mistake, that if we're kind to people, even when it's hard, it's always worth it." Michael felt the air in his lungs freeze. He had said that to her so many times. It had always been his mantra, his belief that no matter how hard life got, no matter how many times people let you down, kindness was the one thing you could always give. But now, as she said it, those words felt like a punch to the gut. He had turned his back on that very idea, and now here she was, reminding him of what he had lost. "You remember that, huh?" he asked softly, his voice cracking. "Yeah," she said, her voice full of sincerity, her little hands holding onto his knee as she looked up at him. "I remember, and I think you're sad because you stopped believing that. You gave up on being kind to someone who really needed you. And I think you should talk to her again." Michael's chest tightened, his heart pounding in his ears. Lily's innocent plea was everything he didn't know he needed to hear. But what if? What if it's too late, baby? What if I messed everything up? Lily shook her head, her face determined. Kindness is never a mistake. You can still fix it. If you love her, you have to show her. You're not a mistake, Daddy. And neither is she. Her words hit him harder than anything else in the world ever could. The simple, pure belief she had in him made everything feel possible again. He could see it in her eyes, see that she still believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. He took a deep breath, the weight in his chest beginning to lift, if only slightly. "I'll try, kid. I'll try." Lily smiled, her face lighting up with that joy only a child could possess, and Michael couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. If she could still believe in him, maybe there was still a chance to believe in himself. Maybe, just maybe, he could find the courage to fix the mess he'd made. Isabella sat at the head of the long, polished conference table, surrounded by the cold faces of the board members she had worked with for years. The room was suffocating, the air thick with tension as they stared at her, their eyes piercing and expectant. The same faces that had praised her for her intelligence, her drive, were now scrutinizing her, judging her for the choices she was making. "Isabella," Thomas Green's voice broke the silence, smooth but laced with an edge. "This is a mistake. You're jeopardizing everything we've built. We've invested too much in Sinclair Enterprises to let personal sentiment get in the way. We don't have room for distractions." She felt her pulse quicken, but she didn't back down. "It's not a distraction, Thomas. It's about doing what's right." A few of the board members exchanged glances, clearly frustrated by her refusal to see reason. Another one, a man with sharp features and a voice that always seemed to carry authority, spoke up. "Isabella, you are not a charity. You cannot afford to be this emotional. You think Carter's small shop is worth risking your future, your career?" Her chest tightened. The familiar cold pressure of their logic pressed down on her. They had always been about numbers, about growth, about power. They couldn't see what she saw, the potential for something more than just profit. For the first time, the weight of their expectations felt suffocating. The truth was clear to her now. "You're right," she said, her voice steady, despite the rising storm inside. "I'm not a charity, and that's exactly why I can't walk away." They stared at her in stunned silence, the shift in the room palpable. Isabella leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "I've spent my whole life building this company, but I can't keep living a life where success is measured only in money. I'm not going to keep pretending I don't see what's wrong." Thomas's face twisted in disbelief. "So you're willing to throw it all away for some mechanic, someone who doesn't even understand what you're offering him?" Isabella's hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "I'm not throwing it away, Thomas. I'm making a choice to do something that matters." She let her gaze shift across the room, meeting each board member's eyes, daring them to challenge her further. "I'm stepping down." The words hung in the air, the weight of them far heavier than she'd anticipated. Stepping away from the company, from everything she'd ever known, was a choice that had been impossible to imagine just days ago. But now, as she looked at their faces, their incredulous stares, she knew she couldn't keep going like this. The room erupted in a mixture of gasps and mutters, but Isabella didn't flinch. This was her decision, and she was ready to face the consequences. "I'm done," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm stepping away from Sinclair Enterprises. For the first time in my life, I'm going to do what's right, not what's easy." The board members stared at her, their faces a mixture of shock and anger. But Isabella didn't care. She had made her choice. She was done being someone she wasn't. And now, for the first time in her life, she was free. Free to follow her heart. Free to make the choice she had put off for too long. She stood up slowly, her legs steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside her. She could feel the weight of everything she was walking away from, but the future she was stepping into felt more real, more hers, than anything she had built behind the glass walls of her office. Without a backward glance, she walked out of the room, leaving the world she had known behind, stepping towards something that, for once, felt right. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft orange glow over the small garage as Michael wiped his hands on a rag, the scent of motor oil and sweat heavy in the air. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was missing, something he hadn't even realized he needed until it wasn't there. It wasn't just Isabella's absence that gnawed at him. It was the quiet echo of everything he had let slip through his fingers. As he reached for another tool, a soft sound cut through the air, followed by the screech of tires on gravel. Michael's head snapped up. His heart skipped a beat when he saw her, a sleek black car rolling to a stop just outside the garage. Isabella. She stepped out of the car, her presence just as striking as it had always been, but this time there was no boardroom suit, no polished look. Her hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail, her face free of makeup, and she wore a plain denim jacket over a white shirt. She didn't look like the woman who had walked away from everything for a life of luxury. She looked human, vulnerable, real. Michael's throat tightened as she walked toward him, her eyes locked on his. There was no hesitation in her step, but the weight of the moment hung between them like an invisible wall. "You came back," he said, Betty, his voice low, the words tasting like something he had been trying to say for days but hadn't been able to. She stopped just a few feet away from him, her chest rising and falling with each breath, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence was thick with everything unspoken, the hurt, the confusion, the tension. But then Isabella's voice cut through it, softer than he expected. "I wasn't being honest with you, Michael." Her gaze softened, her eyes searching his as though she was looking for something. "I told you I had to leave. I told myself that it was for the best, that I had to do what was expected, but it wasn't true. None of it was true." Michael's heart hammered in his chest, the knot tightening in his throat. "Then why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you fight for us?" Isabella took a deep breath, her eyes brimming with emotion. "Because I was scared," she whispered. "Scared of what it would mean, scared of losing myself in the mess of it all. But then I realized this. What we have, it's the only thing that matters. You, Lily, you're the only thing that matters to me." The words hit Michael like a wave, crashing over him with the force of everything he had been holding back. He stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached for her, not sure if he was even allowed to. But Isabella closed the distance between them, her hand reaching up to rest against his cheek, her touch warm and gentle. "I don't care about the business, the money, any of it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "All I care about is you, about making this work, about being with you, building something real. I don't need anything else." His chest ached as he stared at her, the confusion, the anger, the doubt melting away as he saw the sincerity in her eyes. There was no pretending here, no barriers, just the woman he had fallen for, vulnerable, raw, and more real than she had ever been before. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking as he closed the space between them, pulling her into his arms. "I was scared too. I didn't know what to do." Isabella wrapped her arms around him tightly, her breath shaky as she held on to him, her forehead resting against his. "It's okay. We'll figure it out together." For the first time in a long time, Michael felt the weight of his world shift. In this moment, with Isabella in his arms, he wasn't just a mechanic struggling to make ends meet. He was someone who had found love in the most unexpected place, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he wasn't alone anymore. The shop felt colder than usual, despite the warmth of the late afternoon sun creeping through the windows. Michael stood near the workbench, his hands gripping a wrench he barely noticed. His mind was a whirlwind, thoughts racing, heart pounding in his chest. Isabella was there, standing a few feet away, her presence filling the space between them, but still he couldn't bring himself to move, to reach out to her. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, steady and unflinching, but there was something else in her eyes, something he hadn't noticed before, something raw. The walls she'd built around herself had come down, and in that moment he saw her for what she was. Not a businesswoman, not a billionaire with everything she could ever want, but a woman who was afraid. "Michael," she said, her voice shaky yet determined, "you don't have to do this alone." He shook his head, trying to push the storm of doubts away. "I don't know what you want from me, Isabella. I don't know what this is anymore. I can't just forget everything I've worked for." Her breath caught in her throat, her hands clenched at her sides. She stepped closer, her eyes pleading, but the fear behind them was undeniable. "I'm not asking you to forget anything. I'm asking you to trust me. Trust us. This, whatever this is. I need you to see that I'm serious. This isn't just some fling. This isn't a game to me." The words hit him harder than he expected. His throat tightened, and for the briefest moment his eyes blurred. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't control. His entire life had been about fighting, about keeping control, making sure he wasn't at the mercy of anyone or anything. But with Isabella, everything had changed, and the truth was staring him in the face. Isabella took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she stepped closer to him. "Michael, I'm terrified of losing you. I've never been so sure of anything in my life. And now I'm standing here wondering if you'll walk away, and I can't." Her voice cracked, and for the first time Michael saw the vulnerability she had kept hidden for so long. She was afraid of losing him, of letting go of everything she'd worked for, just like he was. But her fear wasn't about money or status. It was about him, about them. Michael's heart twisted painfully as he looked into her eyes. There it was. No more games, no more pretending. This was real. She was real. She wasn't just offering him help. She was offering him a chance at something he had never dared to dream of. "Isabella!" His voice faltered, but he couldn't take his eyes off her. The fear that had gripped him loosened, just enough for him to take a breath, to step forward. "I'm scared too, scared of everything falling apart." "I know," she whispered, reaching out to touch his hand, her fingers brushing against his. "But I can't do this without you. I don't want to. Please, let me show you I'm serious." The words were quiet, but they held more weight than anything he had ever heard. He looked down at their hands, then back up into her eyes. She was standing there, waiting for him to decide, to finally make the choice that would change everything. For the first time in years, Michael realized something. He didn't have to fight this alone, and maybe, just maybe, this was worth fighting for. Without thinking, he took a step closer, closing the distance between them, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe they could make it work. "Okay," he whispered, the word barely escaping his lips. "Okay, let's try." Isabella's breath caught in her chest, and the relief on her face was instant. She reached up to touch his cheek, her smile breaking through the walls they had both built around themselves. And in that moment, as the fear faded away, he knew this was the beginning of something new, something real. And maybe, just maybe, it would be worth the risk. The world felt quiet, as though everything around them had faded into the background. Michael stood there, just inches away from Isabella, his heart beating hard in his chest. He could feel the heat of her presence, the space between them charged with everything unsaid, everything that had built up over the past months. For so long, he had fought it. Fought the pull toward her, the attraction, the connection that felt so strong, yet so impossible. He had convinced himself that it was safer to keep his distance, to protect the one thing he had left, the life he had built. But now, standing here with her, all of those walls he'd constructed seemed like nothing more than fragile illusions. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, her fingers tracing the familiar worn fabric of his shirt. Michael could feel the tremble in her touch, the same uncertainty that had plagued them both. She looked at him, her eyes wide, searching, as if waiting for him to make the decision that would change everything. "You don't have to do this," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm not the man you thought I was." Isabella shook her head gently, her eyes soft. "I never needed you to be anyone else, Michael. Just you." Her words hung in the air, a promise, a declaration. The sincerity in her voice cracked something deep inside him. He had spent so much of his life trying to be strong, trying to prove that he could handle it all. But standing here with Isabella, he realized that true strength wasn't in keeping people at arm's length. It was in letting go, Without thinking, he stepped closer, his hand finding hers, his thumb brushing against the back of her hand as he pulled her toward him. She didn't hesitate, didn't pull away. Instead, she met him halfway, her breath quickening as their faces came together. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved, and then, as though the world had finally aligned, their lips met. It was soft at first, tentative, as if they were both testing the waters, but then it deepened, a surge of emotion flooding between them. The weight of everything they had both carried, the confusion, the pain, the doubt, it all melted away in that single kiss. Michael's heart seemed to burst with a rush of warmth, his hands finding the curve of her waist, pulling her closer, as if he couldn't get close enough. He was kissing her like he had been waiting for this moment for years, like it was the only thing that truly mattered. And for the first time, he realized it was. This was what he had been waiting for, the love he hadn't believed in, the connection that had been there all along, only waiting for him to let go of his fear and reach for it. When they finally pulled away, their breaths mingled, the air thick with everything they had finally admitted to each other. Isabella's forehead rested against his, her eyes closed, her lips slightly parted, as if she were savoring the moment just as much as he was. "I was scared," Michael whispered, his voice hoarse. "I thought I was going to lose everything." She opened her eyes, looking into his with a softness that made his heart ache. "You didn't lose anything, Michael. You gained everything." In that moment, with her standing there, with her love wrapped around him like a shield, Michael knew that he had found something real, something worth holding on to, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was fighting alone. He wasn't alone anymore. The day the papers were signed felt surreal, like the final, crucial piece of a puzzle had clicked into place. Michael sat in his small office in the garage, staring at the documents in front of him, the ink on the page, the numbers, the agreements. None of it seemed real. He had worked his whole life to get to this point, to make something of himself, but now he was staring at something far more significant than a business deal. Across from him, Isabella sat with her hands folded neatly in front of her, her eyes soft but determined. She wasn't wearing the sharp suit she had been known for, the one that made her look every inch the businesswoman who ran an empire. Today she was just Isabella, the woman who had walked into his life, the woman who had seen something in him no one else had. "Are you sure about this?" Michael asked, his voice low, still processing the gravity of it all. "This is a lot." Isabella smiled, her lips curling up in a way that made something in his chest tighten. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady. But there was something more in it now, something deeper than business. "This isn't about money, Michael. This is about building something real, something that matters. And I want to do that with you." He blinked, the words settling over him, sinking deep into the spaces he'd kept locked for so long. The woman sitting across from him wasn't offering help as a billionaire. She wasn't offering some kind of rescue. She was offering partnership. She was offering to walk beside him, not above him, not as someone with more power, just as equals. And for the first time in his life, Michael realized that he wasn't alone in this. He didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. "We'll make this work," he said, more to himself than to her, his hands finally reaching for the pen. He signed his name, the weight of the commitment settling in. Isabella reached over, her fingers brushing against his as she signed beside him. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with something Michael had never seen before, something genuine, something that told him this wasn't just business. "We already are," she replied quietly, her voice thick with emotion. They sat there for a moment, not speaking, just letting the reality of it all sink in. The small-town garage that had once been his entire world now had the potential to be something more, something bigger. And it wasn't just a dream anymore. It was real, built on trust, love, and the understanding that they were no longer two separate worlds. The months that followed were a blur of changes, renovations, new hires, a steady stream of customers. The shop grew, as did their relationship. They worked together, side by side, and every day Michael realized more and more that this wasn't just about business. It was about them, about building something together. Lily, too, was a part of it. She helped when she could, learning from both of them in her own quiet way. The bond between the three of them grew stronger with every passing day, until the garage felt less like a place to work and more like a home. A place filled with laughter, with shared dreams, and with the kind of love that only grew stronger when given room to breathe. And at night, when Michael looked at Isabella, when he held her hand or kissed her goodnight, he realized that the dream wasn't the shop or the business. It was this. It was the life they had built together, from nothing, from their hearts, from the willingness to risk everything for a future they both believed in. They moved forward, not as two separate worlds, but as one. And in that moment, in that life they had created, Michael knew that no matter what came next, they were ready for it, together.